I hope we have at least an hour together, and I would really want to answer your questions and interests more than to lecture you at, on something that is of my interest. But in any event, we'll start with a short story if I manage to download this, and someone has to help me again to get the presentation here. But maybe I'll start with introducing the kind of topics that have become of interest to me. I don't know, how many of you know what informality means? Right? So what do you think that is?
Anything that is out of formality, like out of rules or laws.
Right, exactly. So very common way to think about informality residually. You know, something that is not formal, something that is not written in the law, something that we are not really comfortable to speak sometimes, something that really falls in between. That is normally related to informality. What I've done so far, I've really been working through, starting from Russia, but expanding outwards, is to see what kind of informalities exist all over the world, trying to establish if there is a positive way to define informality, if there is anything we could pin down to say, okay, these kind of practices are informal without referring to formal. And generally trying to question the dichotomy, formal and informal. Because that dichotomy, people who read Pierre Bourdieu and knows the work of other social ethnographers, they know that dichotomies are not the best way to define reality, because it's like black and white, whereas reality always falls somewhere in the middle and is much more complex. So we need to look for alternative categories and concepts to actually get close to how things are in reality. But generally what drives my work is actually an effort to find practices that work. Because you know how with the post-Soviet transition, they always say democracy doesn't work, rule of law doesn't work, institutions have so many defects that various kind of ways around those institutions have to emerge in order to facilitate survival and development. So my question then is, why is it that we look at the world through the prism of what's not working and how? Maybe we should look at the world through the prism of the question, what works and how? So that's the kind of logic that has been driving my focus in research. So where we are, and I titled my lecture, The World Bottom Up, because this is exactly what I'm doing at the moment. I'm trying to develop a vision of the world bottom up, meaning from grassroots onwards, disregarding those important paradigms that exist, and see how the world looks for the people who live in it. Now, what's interesting about this is one cannot do it alone. And what I've done, first of all, I looked for people who do something that I do. So just like yourself, those people who work on informality, I invite you already to contribute to the Global Informality Project, because that's how we work. Everywhere I travel, I try to find people who are capable of articulating what works in their country, and moreover, create a short entry to the Global Informality Project website or to the encyclopedia. So what I am presenting you here is a book that is currently in production. I'm actually looking at the proofs now as we speak this morning. 2 volumes of evidence that we've collected from 5 continents, 66 countries, a very heavy data set, of really a unique data set of data from complex subjects, on multiple moralities, on resilience of informal practices, on what we say now, capability for resistance, survival strategies, all kind of forms which are local in their respective countries, but at the same time, what we also establish is the patterns of similarity between them. So the way we did it, we really looked at people and tried to create a research network. So we now currently have 250 people who have already contributed their pioneering research into informality to us, and we always exchange, like for example, if you write an entry to us, we'll send you similar entries from Colombia or India or other places, so you see just how much that research is similar or different from yours, and try to think about it by comparison. So it's a massive data now, data set that could be helpful for creating comparison or comparative context, but without making direct comparisons. Now, what's interesting here is that we also tried to set up a first ever map of informality, which is to put your entry or your point of interest on the map. For example, you know, my own research, Russia is actually here is between two places. Moscow is normally associated in Google Maps software with former Soviet Union practices. If you put former Soviet Union, it's in Moscow. But if it is somewhere in modern Russia, it's actually associated with Siberia, where I am from originally. So you see how many practices we've identified there, and in encyclopedia, out of 220 entries, we've got about 18 from Russia. But then what we've done, we tried to look at other countries where we know for sure those informal practices exist. For example, when I did my PhD on blood, which is the way of getting things done through personal contacts and networks, what I also knew that there is a way of getting things done in China that is called guanxi. Guanxi is like Russian blood, but different. So how do we establish what works in which context, and whether we could compare those two things, and how do we do that? So what we've created in this data set, that you always have like a wiki page, because it's a sort of collective project based on free contributions by researchers from all over the world. We also use free software. So we use Google Maps for the map, and we use Wiki, which is a free software for creating the data, to frame the data set. So you do have, for example, an entry on guanxi from China. You do have quite a lot of entries at the moment. You could already check the resource in-formality.com. We've got about 150 entries online, and we are updating. The website is under construction at the moment. So we also look for more. But what I find that it's very hard to work with informality. Only brave people do so. Why? Because there is no theoretical framing that actually makes you comfortable researching it, because normally you have to write up your methodology, your disciplinary method. You have to create all those procedures of verification and falsification to make your study scientific or academic, right? So, but with informal practices, when you come up with something that no one researched at all, very often, at least in the West, the reaction is, how can you prove it exists? You know that it's omnipresent. You know it works in your society, but how do you actually prove it? And I myself, I must say, found this very, very difficult, because when I first started working on my PhD on blood, my supervisor then, Anthony Giddens, kept telling me, every supervision, are you sure you're not making it up? how do you know that blood exists? How can you prove it? And every supervision, I have to find the way to say, well, trust me, it exists. But then, when I finished my PhD and actually got a degree, I sent my monograph to Pittsburgh University Press that at that moment had such an impressive list of publications in Russian studies. And I still treasure the facts that they sent me back with a reviewer's point of view. And they said, we could not publish this monograph because there is no way to prove what you say exists. So, and that was really a reality checkpoint for me. And I realized, you know, you have to have those kind of mistakes and failures in life in order to convert it into something like this, where you try to prove it exists, and not just in Russia. It exists everywhere, and it actually construes a universally ubiquitous form of behavior, and it has its own potential in terms of subverting formal institution, as you say, but also the way in which it can support the workings of formal institutions. Example. Very often, people say the Soviet Union has collapsed because its ideology has been eroded. And morally, people were not happy with communism anymore, so they started thinking about consumption, about comfort, about other things apart from communism. And this kind of blood exchanges, they facilitated that corrosion and corruption within the system that inevitably brought its downfall. Okay, that's a point of view. But what you could also say is that if there was no blood, the planned economy, the command economy that existed, it couldn't have survived for 70 years. So in a way, what we are talking about here is an ambivalent functionality of informal practices that actually, yes, they subvert formal institutions, but by so doing, they also support them. And that creates a new creature academically that is very hard to research because its nature is double. And you know how they say about quantum mechanics? You know, when the particle exists in two places at the same time, or it could be both a particle and a wave, it creates that kind of reality in a physical world like semiconductors, which is to say materials that sometimes conduct and sometimes they don't. So what I'm trying to argue is that informal practices are a very interesting type of social fabric that actually has that ambivalent nature. And it's very interesting type of creature to research. And that's why I thought it's probably important to collect data from all over the place and to see if ambivalence is indeed, can be attributed to informality rather than to our peculiar political regimes and economic regimes that actually demand for those practices to emerge in order to substitute for their resistance. Now, ambivalence is a very difficult subject. Why? Because our normal philosophy and logic and disciplinary methods are based on the idea of thesis, antithesis, synthesis. So that's something where we could create a theory that would embrace all facts and try to move our knowledge ahead. This is not how ambivalence seems to be working, because what it is, it has a thesis and antithesis, but there is never a synthesis. Instead, they are flicking like a pendulum, depending on the situation. And here it's very interesting because you have the whole number of phenomena, such as, for example, double think, or double did, or double standard, or double motive, where, strictly speaking, it's absolutely impossible to qualify something that is going on clearly as belonging to one category. This is something about modernity and ambivalence that Zygmunt Bauman has written about, but it's also about the fact that in some societies, the way to function is to be thinking one thing in a formal setting and another thing in an informal setting. And although that type of thoughts could be controversial, they are not necessarily viewed as controversy within your own self. And let me show you one citation which I find really fascinating by Fazil Iskander, who described the Soviet system, for example, and the way in which it created that kind of constant tension. Can you read it from back there? Or can you? So I'm not going to read it out for you. But basically the idea here is that when you live with ambivalence, you could not really reach any consensus. You cannot have integrity. But you are constantly involved in living with a madman. And if that madman is removed, people feel very lost. And that's what happened, to at least some of us with the removal of the communist system. But it's also created a puzzle. Because for me, the puzzle was, Russia is a very good research lab for informality. Like if you want to study informality, there's so much of it, it's almost too much. So for example, in this work, I looked into the informality at the grassroots level, where you really look at the daily workings of networks and how they help the Soviet system. In this work, how Russia really works, I looked into what comes when blood goes. Which practices become really instrumental for the transition with serving democratic reforms, market reforms, rule of law reforms, how those practices envelope new institutions and developments, and that's the 1990s. In this book, I move kind of from Soviet through 1990s to since 2000, and that's basically the first two terms of Putin in the office and the creation of the Putin system, where I look already not at the political and professional networks as here, but so-called power networks. Networks which are used by the regime for governance. And that's where the notion of informal governance has come from, network-based system of governance that is, Putin is known for trusting very few people, putting personal friends in charge of most important projects, and this kind of network-based project management model. Now, what I would say that comes very powerfully from this informal system, from the evidence on informality that comes from all over the world, is the idea of ambivalence and blurred boundaries and gray zones that emerge, and not just from Russia. And I was also thinking, well, Russia, yes, we know that, but is it fair to pin informality on communism or on post-communist world? And when I started looking around, what I realized that, for example, in Latin America, you don't have communism. You don't even have transition, in our sense of the world. But instead, the discourse is different. They talk about poverty and they talk about development. But the informality is very similar to ours. So it looks to me like here, at least around this former Soviet Union, we are thinking about informality as being, contingent on transition, but they don't think it at all. Like if you take Brazil and favelas, or all Latin America and informal, interdependence between people that exist there, the same way in which relationships are used for getting things done, it's absolutely clear it's not just about communism, and it's not just about poverty and development. And then those kind of universal patterns of informality seem to be crystallizing and emerging from looking at different pieces of evidence together. So what I've done in all those 3 books, I looked at the functionality and how those practices can be used. And that really, in response to another pretext, informality is not really only about communism, not only about poverty, not only about survival. Informality is also detrimental to the workings of the formal institutions. And that was another puzzle. You know, is it really? And here again, I looked into the ambiguity or ambivalence of informal practices and discovered that throughout the data set, it's very common that those practices are viewed as a problem by one, but as a solution by another. And that fundamental duality, where informal practices could be both a problem and a solution, creates that sort of dual pattern that seems to be essential for understanding this type of phenomenon. Now, we looked at, you know, transitional practices that I already showed to you that played both supportive and subversive role in terms of transition. And maybe you could give, you know, more examples of that in Georgia, because you had one of the most transitions, I take it, in the post-Soviet space. And clearly informality, you know, must have played a very interesting role in that respect. But we also see how informality at the governance level, you know, by the elites, serves purposes that could be quite instrumental for the country developments. I don't know if you have any examples of that in Georgia, but in Russia certainly we know how, for example, an Olympic village could be built very quickly just because you delegate duties and financing to certain people who you know you can. Very often businesses are loaded with what we call домашние задания by the governments, so that they would take care of certain things. And of course similar patterns exist in the West, because it's what is called corporate responsibility, or relational capital, or something that you do as a business for the environment in which you operate. But then, if the pattern is the same, it's interesting to see what actually defines the difference. And that kind of looking for similarity in differences and differences in similarities create the kind of methodology that is made possible by this global data set. Now, what I would like to maybe mention as a few examples, so that when I say informal governance, you would have a picture in what I mean, is, for example, there is always a facade to informal governance. So there is a certain formal picture. And what we find from the data set that the more facades and the more formality exists, especially with ritual and performance, the more informal the system is. So whenever you have a gap between formal and informal that is small, like for example in the UK, people actually do not distinguish between single and plural in addressing a person. Very often people do not use titles. They are on first terms. So there are certain degrees of flatness in a relationship. Whereas in societies where informality is really substantive and functional, there you see a very formal facade, which would be the case, for example, in China. And you see how, for example, the international ritual for Chinese delegation is to come out, to read out, and not even negotiate or discuss. So that kind of idea where formal and informal are linked to one another is quite an interesting thing, and how you camouflage things. So in Russian discourse, I don't know if you know that phrase of Potemkin villages. So that's where historically, allegedly, there was a Count Potemkin who embezzled a lot of budget. So what he did, he put facades of the villages really high up to where you could not reach without a road. Therefore, that was the way of accountability. So that kind of Potemkin villages are built by everyone who does something, behind the scenes, as it were. But an interesting angle in terms of ambivalence here is that supposedly a real center of power, which is hiding behind here, always depends on the front persons. And that's where we find quite a lot, for example, in London, where you have people who are front people for oligarchic capital, for various financial flows, that they can't really, that the real owners, or they think about themselves as the real owners, cannot really get access to their own fund because formally they belong to different people. So you actually are locked in a situation of leverage with your front person. And that creates a complication and vulnerability vis-à-vis that camouflage pattern. And although it looks attractive, and if you see at the data set, like all schemes of financial schemes, covert ownership, they all have that feature associated with them. Another form of ambivalence that we find very often is where informal governance depends on personalized loyalty. And here you see that a lot of political regimes with authoritarian type of leadership run these systems where you have to be deferential to the leader. And that, of course, it does a number of things to you as a personality, because you really have to, if we say very rudely, kiss the ass. Now, what it means is that fundamentally, if you keep doing it within this system, you really hate the system. You really do hate it, because you have to do it, but you don't like it. And that's where the ambivalence is, because the possibility of change is actually there, because all those people could stand up at one moment together. And that really creates a potential in a very rapid change. So that kind of ambivalent type of perspective is instrumental for looking for potential in terms of policy and development. Now, the context boundedness of all those patterns, is really what makes informality efficient. We already said that informality may be not straightforwardly linked to communism, not strictly speaking linked to poverty, not necessarily associated with development, not necessarily associated with dysfunctionality of formal institutions, but it certainly depends on the context. And that kind of complexity of the context and the multiplicity of contexts is something that one has to be thinking about when attempting to analyze, a different variety of informal practices. So, what I would like to tell you very briefly is that ambivalence has got literature in classic sociology, also in social anthropology, but actually not much. So you have social ambivalence being first conceptualized, as many things actually, by Robert Merton, who was a very famous American sociologist, as contradictory demands on the occupants of the status. And this, just to give you an example, if you are a good bureaucrat, you could not be a good brother. Because if you are a good brother, you have to help family. But if you are a good bureaucrat, you have to help the iron cage. Now, if you are in that chair where you have to make good bureaucratic decisions, you have contradictory demands on your shoulders, and you have to get out of them depending on the context, depending on who asks for what, how can you get away with that, and all the contexts become definitive to your behavior. Now, there are some systems in the world where demands on a brother would not really be as powerful, and you could actually combine the two practices quite happily. So you could be a good brother and a good bureaucrat. But in societies with deficiency of resources, where serving the family becomes a matter of honor, especially in Africa, like for example, if you are elected by a local community and you are not redistributing funds back to the community that elected you, you're actually viewed as a corrupt individual. Meaning that when you are corruptly redirect funding towards your community, that's considered to be honorable. But when you do not, as a good bureaucrat, you're considered corrupt. So there is a complete reversal of what's happening in terms of moral meanings in that particular society. So that kind of idea of social ambivalence is a kind of interesting one also because there are, as we discussed, informal practices which are very hard to classify clearly, to refer to one category. You cannot really say that these informal practices are subversive and these ones are supportive. And let's support supportive practices and get rid of subversive ones. That's unfortunately, that's not how it works. So you have to devise policy that would actually be mindful of both things and try not to ruin the supportive influence and enhance the avenues, but also trying to reduce the subversive elements of that. And this kind of perspective is exactly what is totally missing from the policy-making world. And that's exactly the kind of line of thinking that we would like to introduce to international organizations, and that's why this project is becoming, so much in demand, because the way in which we assemble unwritten rules, open secrets, hidden practices is something that has never been taken into account in understanding local context. And that maybe has got some potential. So, in terms of ambivalence, what we've established in this project is 4 types. I'm not going to tell you about this in detail because it's quite technical, but I'm just going to show you pictures, give you some ideas, and if you'd like, ask me, and then we'll continue that discussion. But really, substantive ambivalence is a logic of a double think. So it's something when you could not really say it's one thing or another. The idea of double think was first expressed by George Orwell in his novel 1984. I don't know if you read about this, but it's an interesting idea that you could develop mentality where you take absolutely conflicting views, but you don't feel it. It's okay to say one thing in a party committee because everyone understands you're camouflaging your real views. And then another thing you say to a friend in a kitchen, which would be opposite, but you don't see it as a contradiction. So what we've discovered here, especially with regard of the practices of redistribution. Practices of redistribution, that's a pattern where informally you take resource and you channel it to someone who might not be entitled to it formally. Which is to say, if you do things by blood, or guanxi, or jintinho, or any other type of practice, then you are actually redistributing resources. Now here on the left you see the instrumentality of sociability. So in fact, because it's impossible to differentiate friendship from the use of friendship, you see a lot of people who say, okay, I'm a good friend, I'm a good brother, so that's just what I do. And there are other people who say, well, actually, you know what he does? It's instrumental. It's actually a form of petty corruption. And the borderline is really blurred. It depends if I do it or if they do it. And normally, if it's they, it's corruption. If it's I'm a good friend. And that kind of blurriness in, or double standards, as one could say, is really instrumental in workings of informality. The same thing comes with the sociability of instrumentality, which is another side of this tension between sociability and instrumentality, and it's associated with small tensions, small payments in corrupt context, and giving gifts. So that sort of blurred boundaries between gift giving, tipping, little money, friendly money, petrol money, coffee money, little favors, something that ends up in straightforward Ustarella in Italy and Dash in Nigeria, which is a form of bribe that is quite forced. But you know, an interesting thing, of course, here is that you think, okay, in our mentality, gift is something that is not money. But that's exactly what doesn't work in Asia. In Asia, gift is the money. So you have all those kind of songli in China, okurimano no shukan in Japan. These are actually very nicely enveloped money. But it's actually not a bribe, it's a gift. So you kind of see all those blurred boundaries around which sociability and instrumentality engage with one another in social type of relations. So the next type of ambivalence, the second type, is a normative ambivalence. And that's really about the double standards, whereby one allows oneself what one doesn't allow others. And that actually applies very well to practically all politicians, because they think they do it for the interests of the people, or businessmen who think they do it for the sake of their companies. And that's where it's kind of borderline with another forms of ambivalence called motivational. But it's in our data set, what's interesting here is the fact that the type of solidarity that you may feel towards your community, towards your clan, towards your family, towards your tribe, actually also has a lock-in effect on you. In the sense that if you are being loyal, you are also being locked into this sort of loyalty. And if you break out, you will engage in what we call non-conformist forms of behavior, which are on the right-hand side. So you see how, for example, lock-in effect is very instrumental to all kind of, I don't know if you recognize birja here, which is in the youth culture. And also you have a lot of practice associated with the way of resistance, or trying to break away from the conformist culture of local community, which is to say the youth culture, for example, would always come up with alternative ways of speaking or jargons or subcultures in order to break away from the type of lock-in that tradition and belonging imposes on them. The next type is functional ambivalence, or the double did. We discussed it a little bit already, but just to show you which practices came up very prominently in the data set, they are associated with the way you are helping yourself live and survive. So some practices are really serving the dictum, the system made me do it, which is to say practices of survival, everything you feel you're pressed to do. And the blurred boundary of that is, where do you put a borderline between what you feel you have to do and gaming the system in order to benefit or increase your chances. And here, the star example in one of the entries is a European Union official whose monthly salary is 4,000 euros. She has a 4x4, she has 3 kids in private schools, and she feels, you know, she's surviving, therefore she needs to engage in practices to benefit, you know, her own family, and she genuinely believes it's a survival. Now, you know, talking about survival in Africa, and when you see it in context, you see just how incongruent that claim is, but in her head, that's exactly what she's doing. So that kind of borderline is also quite blurry. And the practice of gaming the systems, they actually could be quite intricate and fascinating, and actually also engage new laws that you might be able to push through in order to benefit you in a formal way. And that's where the tricky thing comes, right, about power and domination, which is the last part and last type of ambivalence associated with motivational ambivalence, where you could really use your power in order to co-opt followership, to engage in practice to sustain and your power or increase it, on the one hand, create sustainability in power, or on the other hand, you really have to have forms of informal control in order to sustain. So basically, to say it simply, these are the carrot practices and these are the sticks practices. So you kind of have very interesting mixture and evidence from everywhere where you could co-opt elites, for example, to support you, and you could be co-opted into the workings of societies, but you could also be forced to do that and informally controlled. So that's basically how the data set has been crystallized. So what we created a www.in-formality.com website where all the entries are welcome and they are crowdsourced, and you could search by country, by region, by practice, by pattern. But we also have an encyclopedia where we tried to actually see the clusters and the constellations of informal practices, trying to create the informal worldview. The world, how it looks, if you look at it bottom up. And thank you very much.
My question is the following. You know, we have some kind of understanding of what a modern society is. This modern society is functionally differentiated, which means that each kind of system of society, be it politics, law, economy, etc., has its own set of rules, codes, whatever. And in each time we see the blurring of those rules. We say, well, this is a kind of corruption, decay, etc. Now, this suggests a kind of quite distinct, let's say, normative, you know, just kind of picture of how this modern society should work. And if there are societies which do not correspond to this normative kind of picture, then, you know, so bad for them, and they should work kind of, yes, towards the progress. Now, what does the introduction of this very complex concept or concepts of informality change in this picture? Because whether we want or not, there are, let's say, more modern segments of world society than others. So what does your approach change in that quite clear-cut picture? That will be my question.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's an excellent question, because we are indeed operate, think, and project a normative vision upon societies. and we do roughly feel and know what modernity is, we know that any transition from authoritarian regime should lead to democracy, and democracy should lead to growth, and growth should lead to development. So we do have what economists would say economic tenets. You know, we do, for example, buy a lot of assumptions into how we think about the world. For example, that humans are rational creatures and they ordinarily would try to maximize their profits. So that corruption actually is detrimental to growth. That's another tenet that economists have. The problem with this normative vision is that it's not always true. Like Thomas Carruthers has shown in his famous article on the end of transition paradigm, is that out of 100 regimes which were authoritarian and tried to transition elsewhere, only 20 at the point of his writing, which was 2002, have ended up with consolidated democracies. Now you have to take Poland and Hungary out of that list, so it's 18. So you do have that kind of developments on the ground which are very hard to explain from a normative point of view. Besides, when you think about the world normatively, you are locked into a certain type of thinking. So what social ethnographers teach us is that in order to discover things that are novel, you have to suspend, not necessarily abolish your normative thinking, but just to suspend it in order to establish new way of looking at the world. And I feel that's exactly what we are trying to do collectively in this project. We are trying to identify things that you would never identify if you were normative. Those practices would just not be part of your picture of the world. Why do we do that? Is because we are interested is why was the failure of anti-corruption reforms so dramatic in so many countries. Maybe Georgia is one happy exception, apart from Singapore and Hong Kong, but it's really has been staggering how anti-corruption reforms have been best designed, best funded. 25 years since the collapse of the Soviet Union have been spent on fighting corruption. And what we find today is that the world is not really less corrupt than before, and maybe more, also because we know much more about it. So the original question for this project was, why do anti-corruption reforms do not work? And this is the question why. Because there are all those practices on the ground that are actually there, often non-articulated, that are effectively blocking the working of reforms. So our suggestion is, if you want to design policies that would work, you have to take contexts into account. And that's the context.
Could I maybe push this question into a practical dimension? Is it possible for informal practices to serve the cause of modernization? We are in Georgia, the country is modernizing, keeps on modernizing. Are there ways of using traditional ways of doing things to accelerate, to enhance this modernization, in your view?
Well, a short answer to this question, please read my article, which is called From Russia with Blood, Can Informal Networks Help Modernize Russia? But the shorter question is, I think that's exactly the point, because informal practices have got this supportive side and a very important capacity. Of course it could be put to a good use. And a good example from Georgia would be, for example, take something that is very traditional, like hospitality, something that is often viewed to be on the margins with corruption, because you could do a lot of things with hospitality and expenses and gift-giving and favors and invitations and developing networks through hospitality. You could actually turn it into business. You could turn it into something that is conducive to modernization. And I think that kind of way of thinking in terms of conversion of traditional practices that are considered to be informal and putting it into a certain channeling that would benefit the economy and people at a grander scale, that's exactly the know-how.
Thank you.
Thank you for your question.
So,
Good. Actually, I have a lot of things to say. Thank you for your interesting presentation. I'm working on my dissertation, which is about informality, I would say, but it's about criminal subculture in post-Soviet Georgia, which is about civic law, war in Zakona. So I'm arguing that informality is very heavily connected to the criminal subculture, in particular the civic law into post-Soviet Georgia. So in my dissertation, I'm arguing that criminal subculture created somehow this kind of paradigm of career paradigm where you could become how it is possible to become a civil law, and he was giving you this kind of socialization agents, kind of play game, socializing in the street, like you do this judicial job, and after you initiate yourself, commit crime, and after you got that title. My question is about if in your survey you could find this, if there was the same kind of stages for the informality kind of in other states where this network, where informality created networks of socialization, like young men how to become a part of informal subculture.
Well, I've got three comments on this. So first of all, look out for the book by Mark Galeotti on seeds and laws that is coming out in May from Routledge, I believe. So he's done a historical analysis of it, and it might be of interest. Second, I would question understanding that a mafia-type organization is an informal institution. And you probably know that in political science, both corruption and mafia are viewed to be an informal institution. In my way of thinking about ambivalence, about the way in which complexity should be part of informality, I would say mafia type of organizations is not really informal in nature. Sometimes they are more formal than formal institutions, because you have a clear hierarchy. As you say, coming from stage to stage, a career path, a promotion, is something that is really contradicts the informal fluidity of practices. I would say, well, if you look, for example, for Amerta Code, initiation rites, or Mafia Raj institution in India in our data set, you will see that some of them are really, maybe not necessarily could be referred strictly as informal, and that's exactly why I told you in the beginning that formal-informal is not really useful dichotomy for describing the type of reality you want to get to.
Shall I get something like in shadow? I would say that the mafia is a part of informal, like we can say, for example, in the Soviet Union, shadow economy, how mafia was involved in how, or post-Soviet, like how they were creating Grisha, roof, so it is part of informality, right?
It's illegal.
It's illegal.
Not necessarily informal. Do you see what I mean? That It just depends how you define formal and informal. If you associate formal with legality, it's one thing. But in a way to accommodate the complexity that we are talking about in your case, seeds of law and the kind of hierarchy that works in prisons, you know, we call it informal because that's our best way of addressing it, because it's not really anywhere near formal institutions and it's hidden. But if you look at it, the seeds in law have got a code that is very well described. In fact, the prison code is very often mapped and even written. If it's written, and if it's not fluid, and if it's strongly enforced, I question the informal nature of that institution.
But that was the second part of the question. Do you know of any other networks where there is a clear progression in the ranks, in your informality
Oh, you mean
research?
generally?
Yes, yes.
I have to look from that angle. And you could also look for yourself because it's all in open access. But I think what you are saying about the progression indicates to me that this institution is not informal, if you see what I mean. Because that sort of progression and predictability already says that there is a certain logic to the workings of that institution that is deprived of ambivalence and fluidity, and the enforcement and the rigor of it and the violence. Actually, that's why I started by saying I don't agree with political scientists who associate mafia type of organization with informal institution.
Thank you very much. My question is about when we saw these maps and data, like we saw that like actually everywhere informal practices. But can we say that let's say in more prosperous societies, in more developed societies or countries, economically, let's say, where formal institutions are working, and actually formal and informal, you all this need for achieving something. And if you are achieving your goals with formal, let's say, direction, then informal practice are less. Is there this correlation, or we cannot find this correlation?
We were also puzzled by that. As I said, you know, the level of development was our hypothesis and its correlation to informality. So I looked first at those countries which are on the best end of the anti-corruption index, corruption perception index with Transparency International. And they are, you know, Denmark, Finland, Sweden, you know, countries where formal institutions work. And what I discovered there is that there are very powerful informal codes, just as they are in the UK, which is not so high, but you know, considered to be a relatively working country in terms of institutions. All countries have got informality that is essential for operation. Take Denmark. Take Denmark, it's janteloven. What it is, it's an informal code where you are not supposed to stick out. So they really put quite a lot of community pressure on individuality. So you are not supposed to get the best marks in school. Children never get best marks in school. They never get grades good enough to enter, for example, a UK university, because they're just never good enough on paper. And that way they promote that kind of consensual, equalized type of interdependence which presses down on the individuality. That works actually, by the way, also in Norway and in Sweden. It's the same janteloven. So we do have, for example, in Finland, interesting networks which are called networks of dear brothers, holiday. So they are the kind of networks of informal influence which are extremely powerful. If you want to be part of the elite in Finland, you have to be part of this. How do you become part of this? You have to first of all grow up in Finland and get to serve in their military training that takes place just for 3 months. But those 3 months are essential because you are put together with other people of your stature, and then you become meeting with each other every year, and that's a must. And they are so beneficial for your career and development that each year growing together creates that kind of very powerful network for you. In Switzerland, they've got network of little cousins. They are the ones which are, in German speaking, associated again with the Swiss model of consensual democracy. I don't know if there are political scientists here, but you know, the Swiss model of democracy is very different from others because the contestation is there, but actually a lot is placed on creating consensus before the elections, which is, by the way, very similar pattern to corporate settings in Asia, where the agreements are achieved before you actually go to the boardroom to vote. So you have that practices which are very powerful, and researchers who report and produce research on that, they say it's actually definitive for the way in which society works. The difference is that that sort of informality doesn't necessarily clash openly with formal institutions the way we are thinking about it, because from our background it looks like a direct clash. But it's certainly there and it's integrated. And of course the best type of informal pattern is the one which is like a British, you know, way of creating a road. You first put a load, then you let people walk around it. Once you see where the path is, you place asphalt. So that's how the law should ideally be created, in the sense in which common law system emerge, as opposed to the civil law, where you put asphalt first and then you tell people, you walk here. You know, this is the law code. But that kind of integration of informal institutions into formalized codes is exactly what creates that consensuality that our part of the world is missing, not only because we've got civil code, but also because we have, you know, fairly sort of dramatic history.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, very interesting. I wanted to ask you the question, and your answer to Jacqueline's question gave me this idea to ask you again. So the informality has this ambivalence in itself also, maybe, that it is a resistance but obedience at the same time. There are in case of every strategies or every rule or law, there will be a lot of tactics which people employ in every society, regardless of being rich or not. In case of Soviet floods, etc., I think you showed perfectly well that it was both supporting the system and also deteriorating the system. I don't know if you would agree about this double meaning of informality everywhere, or would you say that it is less of resistance and more somehow cohabiting or somehow maneuvering, but always staying underneath, always remaining weak, so to say?
It's very hard to generalize about informality. I think that this whole kind of purpose of this project is to actually add complexity and context-rich evidence to the picture. I think there would be patterns you will find in encyclopedia, for example, associated with informal dwelling and informal income, that are fairly functional and essential and even visible. Because what I discovered about informality, for example, that the best work ever in terms of policy thinking, in terms of handling informality, is done by development studies and urban planners. Because favelas, slums, shanty towns, all kind of informal types of dwellings, they are best developed by urban planners because they are in your face. Because people, when they have nowhere to live, like migrants now, they are either occupying some territories that are not regulated, or the state creates, camps and territories which are not really quite regulated according to the rule of law in that country, so they are kind of segmented. And in that setting, you will see that you would then have to think, what do you do with that informality? Because you could not just bulldoze everything away, because people need somewhere to live. So you have to create that sort of supportive side of things. But then you have to think how to make it less subversive, which is eliminate risks of disease, contamination. You then have to have sanitation, fresh water, facilities. So you kind of work both ways. And that sort of ambivalent policy is something that is absolutely essential. And I think that sets up a very good sort of line of thinking for the forms of informality which are less visible. Because you think by parallel, and I think it helps a bit. But there is certainly that sort of fluidity and difficulty about getting to the context-bound informal practices. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I'm not sure how much it's a question. When we are speaking about transferring these lessons to the policy community, why should we really assume that those agents of development, especially international organizations, are not really already involved in these double practices? And to saying this is not only a matter of criticizing, like political criticism. I mean, I'm sure you're pretty familiar with this notion of organized hypocrisy. Social scientists already understand that any big organization is involved in this if it wants to achieve at least some of its goals, should follow several sometimes contradictory lines. So I don't know. Maybe it's we should find better ways to politicize this, if we want social scientists to politicize this notion, then suggesting policy, not simply, but suggesting policy solutions.
I think, in terms of big organizations and the way it works, I mean, there has been so much criticism of civil society organizations and large international organizations and corruption within the anti-corruption industry and all those things that I guess you referred to. And that's absolutely true. But in my work, I'm not really guided by any sort of activism or attack on anywhere. What we had is actually World Bank and Transparency International coming to us, which was the team of European Union funded project on anti-corruption, asking us to come up with better ways of measurement or creating indicators or seeking theoretical perspective or at least something that would work, because they just ran out of juice with their policy thinking. Because, for example, the research department of the World Bank, people who are on board of our anti-corp team, they say, well, I've got all those governments, someone gets elected, they come to us, they say, okay, what do we do now? We want to get rid of corruption, just like Ukraine struggles at the moment. So what the World Bank has is a standard package that has always been given, for anti-corruption policies, which has actually proven that they are not really operational, and the political will that everything hangs on is really short-lived because of the election cycle. So you do have quite a lot of factors. So what we are saying with this data set is that if you have a really good medicine, like a pill, you put it into water, you drink it, it works. But if you take the same medicine, you put it into soup, a chemical reaction starts, you drink it, you might fall sick. You never know what's going to happen. So what we are doing, we are trying to undo the soup before putting the medicine in there. So that's the kind of line of thinking.
Thank you for your lecture. So I was wondering if you could elaborate a bit about the relationship between the concepts of informality and social capital, especially the so-called bonding social capital, because they seem to be congruent in many ways.
Mm-hmm.
So that was my question.
Well, that's an excellent question. So first of all, I would start by saying that informality is a kind of concept that doesn't have a definition. It has a history. Mm-hmm. And it's quite an interesting history because if you read his heart and his story about he came up with this idea of informal sector in Africa that was used by the World Labour Organization back in 1972, and how the whole thing has been picked up by the economists and how it developed into this notion of informal economy and all that. It's quite interesting in its own right. But the fact is, to me, part of this history is the fact that informality is a context-bound phenomenon, and it has a different name everywhere. So I refer to it as an umbrella term, as informality, but when I come to the data, I prefer to use local categories. So what the concept of social capital does, it creates a concept that presumes comparison top-down, in the sense that you measure bonding social capital in Georgia versus bonding social capital in Ukraine, then in Russia, then elsewhere, then you assemble data and you compare. So my thinking that it's very difficult to compare. You think you could compare things, but actually when you look bottom up at the context within which those bonding informal practices occur, they are different and serve different purposes. Therefore, you have a much subtler, maybe more complex picture of what's happening than when you compare it top-down. So it's basically social capital top-down, various forms of informal practices, it's bottom-up. And that's the difference.
I see. Thank you.
But let's take first question first and then we go to second.
Have you ever thought that an informal network, a powerful informal network, might become a formal network with formal goals? Because you mentioned the term dual standards. When a network is informal and very powerful, somehow these dual standards or triple standards might become one standard. Have you ever discussed that thing?
Well, to undo your question, which is excellent, and which is, we've just discussed, right, this kind of idea of a loan, where we do make a pass informally and then we pave it. So that would be one way of thinking about informal being instrumental to formalizing things. And formalizing informal things would be an important part of policy thinking as well. However, when you bring the notion of networks, it becomes a little bit more complicated because network is not something that you could map very easily. Because my understanding of network is that it's something that you develop throughout your career path or developmental biography, your parents, your friends, your school, your army, your everything. However, that network is never actualized as a network. It only becomes actual when you have a problem emerging in which you want to solve, right? So you would only think that your former classmate has just been appointed somewhere in case you have a business that might be related to that, and otherwise that network would be dormant, right? So when you say formalizing network, do you mean network that is that kind of dormant network? Well, to me, you cannot really formalize it because in a way it has already been formalized because you were part of the same school as a formal network. And then just a few contacts remain and they become informal only if you get in touch. Otherwise, it just remains somewhere there. So, in terms of power networks, like for example the ones that I study in the context of the Kremlin and the Putin system, what I'm looking at is different contexts within which his networks have emerged. For example, we've got his security, secret police service in Leipzig. Oops, Mr. Sechin emerges because they were together there. So you do have people who he worked together in the mayor's office in St. Petersburg. Again, oops, you have Mr. Kudrin emerging and Mr. Medvedev, the receptionist at the mayor's office in St. Petersburg at the time. So you have people who work within the wider context of the KGB in his time, right? So you do have other agents there. So you do have his school and apparently kindergarten. You do have his dacha cooperative, Ozera, where he's got neighbors, and the Kovalchuki and other people, and lots of brothers and Rotenbergs. So you do have a network construed from different contexts in his life. Does he need to formalize it? You could say, well, what is formalization? You mean that they all get together and organize, party, or, of course no. What he does instead, he uses different contacts that he has for different projects. So he puts Rotenbergs for building, Kovalchuki for banking. He puts people like Abramovich who are relatively new, and he actually inherited from Yeltsin in charge of the World Cup 2018. Football, its network is a fluid category. And I think that's what I stand by, this kind of idea of fluidity and complexity that, could not be expressed in a simple formula, formalized. If I make myself clear.
Well, by the net and by the data, it was like mainly indicated like Russia or like Argentina or something like that. But did you analyze there, let's say, nations which either don't have their state or maybe have state but were spread, for example, Jews or Armenians also. They have state both, but are there any specific or interesting or some differences between the between the nations, let's say, which are predominantly living on their land, and between those who are a little bit spread around?
Thank you. That's another excellent question that allows me to argue for and in favor of the bottom-up type of perspective, because, for example, the 2012 International Handbook of Informal Governance goes like, informal practices in Europe, informal practices in Asia, informal practices in Americas. And then they just really take it country by country. And each scholar individually looks like that. So what we are doing, we are identifying patterns and then put them together regardless of where they come from. And then we work bottom up from wherever they might spread. So for example, this janteloven, it comes from Denmark, but actually spreads across the border around the Nordic countries. You have, for example, practices of petrol money, where you pay a little tip to a custom official, and it spreads all over sub-Saharan Africa. So what you have then, when you put it in the table of contents of the encyclopedia, is that the geographical borders get redefined by practices. So you do have, you know, you show the fluidity of the borders. And that actually is quite interesting how practices travel. For example, we've got practices of Havala. That's an undergraduate, underground banking, which is to say you could pay something for one country and then your family will receive this money minus little percentage in another country without any trace. And Havala, of course, now is very important because of the terrorist funding and all the risks associated with that. But Havala is a very clever system that has very interesting set of borders, where it works, where it doesn't. But in London, it works very well because you go to East London and you see Havala centers, so you could go and pay somewhere in Iraq in a minute. So you also, by looking at those kind of patterns, you don't really disregard national borders. Of course, they are very important, but the next question is, how do they migrate? Do they migrate with diasporas? Are practices carried by people? Do they actually survive and multiply well in a foreign environment? And that sort of migration of informality is like the next stage. So we're not there yet. We are just really busy, putting this data set together. But it's really, there is so much wealth there and perspectives on what you could do with that, especially with filling the blind spots and thinking by analogy, finding things that you never thought existed. Like, who would have thought about Denmark, that they are actually, against individualism? I could never actually suspect that. But that's an interesting find. And that actually explains quite a bit about society where suicidal rates are just as high as the rates of happiness, which kind of is an interesting take on ambivalence. So anyway, I'm just inviting you to browse and maybe have some ideas, do something of your own with that, because that's effectively what we want. We want it to be used and expanded.
Well, thank you so much for this. Pleasure to announce that by the decision of the Academic Council of Ilia State University, for her deep insights into the region, but also into the phenomena of informality and corruption, we award Aliona Ledeniova the honorary doctorate of the university. So we'll conduct a small ceremony now. This is the robe. We will just kind of, you don't have to put it, we just kind of can. Yes, I think this will work.
This one, the tail goes in the back?
Yes, it does. And this is the diploma and the medal.
Oh, thank you. Wow.
So,